So this should build quite nicely on what we've just spoken about, data. But we're talking about data and creativity and how UK mobile ad buyers are starting to align teams and maximise the value of data. The first data point that we have, which is actually really positive and a really different stat to what we've heard over the last few years, is that today almost 3/4 of UK mobile ad buyers say that they believe they are maximising the value of mobile data, specifically when planning ad campaigns. And what we've heard all along is that not enough is being done here, and it's a huge challenge, and there aren't enough brands and agencies that are really aligning these teams. What do you think's driven this change?
I must admit I was quite surprised when I saw the research come back. And that's not to denigrate any of the good activities that are happening across the whole value chain, if you like, of using data to improve on not just mobile targeting and insights and measurement, but I think that in general across all screens. But it does suggest that we've moved on a lot. I think we've all probably attended this conference quite a lot over the last few years, or have attended over the last few years, and we've been talking about similar issues. So I think the first thing we'll take is really positive from that. We surveyed collectively over 230 people. So we take that data at face value. It's pretty encouraging to see that the media buying community feels pretty good about what they are doing, and how they are actually behaving. So that's good. First good news, that we feel like we're using some data in its most optimal fashion, to 70% maximising the opportunity. But I think what's really interesting is that actually there's a shift in this research away from, and interesting talking about GDPR, I'm not going to go back down there, but I think a lot of what was talked about earlier is an incredibly complex issue. But a lot of the shift of the research that we've seen publishing today is that third-party data is the least important data set, that first-party data is the most important. I think that's encouraging for all of us as we approach on a world where opt-in becomes the default and CRM becomes I think goes back to being one of the most important data sets for all activation, not just direct marketing. So it's good to see that the media buying community is embracing that as a kind of real opportunity and feel that they're maximising that. So I think those are positive things. But I think, that said, there is a huge amount of work left to be done in terms of actually, making permission data available to those communities. Still, the media agency is the default position for clients to activate on mobile. I think that needs to evolve. It's not a question of agencies or not agencies. Agencies have a massively important role to play. But it's also about clients themselves equipping themselves to be able to activate not only in programmatic media, but in ways across the whole shopper marketing into media environment. So I think the use of first-party data, both from the device and for CRM combining, becomes a huge opportunity for clients to do themselves as well as to rely on the agencies to help them to do it.
So if we look at this as kind of the foundation, this is the first time we've got a majority saying that they are maximising the value of data. What needs to happen next to carry on building on this and not getting complacent or not being left behind?
Well, I guess there's a sort of, if you're talking about the shift in metrics and how it can be, how data really plays out and creates value, I think the first obviously is in targeting, is there's the bigger opportunities that are being exploited there, but actually it's often in measurement. I think as we're seeing, the less of a pool of data available for bigger campaigns, as I think Mark from Zenith was saying, we need to be really mindful of how to measure in real-world activities. So how we can start to use footfall measures and real sales measures as ongoing metric, and I think that's showing through in this research, where there's a big shift away from metrics that are based on simple clicks and views that seem to be dropping off a cliff in this research. What we're seeing is a sharp increase in the use of real-world measures, both in terms of footfall measures, secondary actions, and actual sales measures to demonstrate value.
And do you think the onus is on brands to look at what they should be measuring rather than, as you said, taking a default of clicks or sales necessarily and coming up with their own custom measurements? Or is there a one-size-fits-all for everyone?
I think increasingly it's going to come back down to whatever objectives are. We're not sounding too generic. It's really just a shift in actually applying some decent metrics in the start of the campaign, rather than thinking that it's a one-off kind of once in a blue moon campaign that you're going to measure some real world uplifts. So I think it's just getting that into the general run of behaviours. I think we'll talk a little bit later on about how that's shifting from the creative process being separate from the data analytics piece. But I think if you see what needs to happen is just simply to start with a bigger question of what does success look like in the real world, rather than what success looks just in terms of media metrics. I think, and the whole data world that we've been discussing through the lens of GDPR is only going to make that more important. It's only going to be more important that as a brand, I want to engage in and see some real world uplift, rather than just rely on a media metric as a kind of benchmark.
And where do you think the responsibility for continued innovation lies? Do you think it lies with the tech vendors, with the agencies, or with brands, or how does that play out?
Well, I think we have, over the last few years, we've seen a lot more tech, haven't we, to make permissioned data more available and readily available, easier to use, if you like, across any of these different points, be it on the client side, be it on the agency side, be it on the tech vendor side. So I think there's still a lot of innovation to come through there. Onboarding of CRM data and making that readily available. Everyone I expect has talked, touched on today, the universal ID the mobile device can offer. I don't think that is a myth. I don't think that's as far away as people think. But that does require, that identity graph that was touched on earlier as potentially being in jeopardy based on GDPR. I actually think there's lots of ways around that, and this research is suggesting that actually CRM data is a massively important factor when coming to building out new audiences and better targeting and better measurement. So in that regard, we need better technology to enable us to scale CRM data coming into the environment. So the onboarding piece, there's some great businesses in play now that enable us to do that. And I think there's some, actually the US is better than we are here in Europe about using CRM data for better targeting. So I think the scaling of that technology is required. Match rates aren't significant enough yet to make it part of every campaign in terms of using that first-party data in a meaningful way with the ad-side data. But it's coming and it's happening. So I think the ready availability of that technology, but also then the capability set on the other side, which enables just everyone to be able to use that tech. They are simple SaaS businesses that exist. LiveRamp through mParticle, those type of data platforms exist. So I think it's a question now of making sure that there are people on the ad buy side that are capable of using those technologies to build out better audiences. And I guess if we're getting into sort of tech soup, then clearly the DMP plays a role in that as well. So having that readily available and cheaply available to all parts of the value chain makes sense, and I think we'll see greater scale, and the research suggests that.
And we did see a big difference between those who say they are maximising the value of data, have a real preference for CRM data, first-party data, whereas those who aren't maximising the value are still leaning heavily towards DMP data. Do you think that's the right thing to do if they don't have the insight into the data? Should they still be leaning that way, or do you think everyone should be moving around to the customer data?
Well, I think it's both. I don't think we should be thinking that third-party data is no longer something of interest for making smart audiences or targeting and insight campaigns, or insight for those targeting campaigns. So I wouldn't sit here and say that. But at the same time, it's saying, well, there are lots of well opted-in first-party data sources available. Not only on the CRM side, but you could also talk about location data from devices. Those data sets are more readily available than they've ever been. So a lot more publisher collaboration with ad tech and technology platforms that are enabling that data to surface up and be more readily available. And I think as well, everyone's much more interested now, I think, on back of this kind of conversation where that data isn't just made available out in the open market, so in what would have traditionally been a third-party DMP open environment, but looking at more sort of private data marketplaces where more first-party data can be readily shared. I think this research also showed that second-party data was significantly increased since the last survey.
Yeah,
and access to it. So that's encouraging as well of partnerships and the other first-party data sets, if you like, or data that belongs to me as a component part of a campaign, allowing that to be readily available. And I think, again, that speaks to some of the tech that's come along, which makes it a safe environment for first-party data to be shared. So I think the opportunity is in that becoming much simpler and more seamless in terms of the ability for that tech to be applied. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, despite the fact that our media buying community is telling us that they think they're maxing out on data. I think there's a bigger opportunity there yet.
So let's shift over and talk about creative, because this research was all about data and creativity. Those who are more used to using data maximising the value, that group, when we asked them which type of ad formats they use, they were using many, many more ad formats than those who aren't, who tend to rely on the static banner formats. What are the key trends you see? Which ad formats are the most popular? Which are working well? Is there a difference brand by brand as to what works?
It is always a mix. I mean, I think that research is showing that more dynamic ad formats coming through is very encouraging. The shift away, it showed that the majority of buyers who said that they weren't maxing out the data opportunity often defaulted to a simple standard banner. Whereas anyone that was demonstrating they really understood and were taking the data opportunity were using 3 or 4 different ad formats in a single campaign, which suggests that actually the creative opportunity has been seized to talk in different formats at different times in different modes of that device movement, that person's day. So I think those are pretty obvious things to state, but up until now that hasn't been the case. So I think it's good to see coming through in some hard research that actually canopy formats, smart rise video formats, just smarter use of the mobile smaller screen are actually actively being undertaken now. So I think that's a good indication of the coming together of data and creativity, which I think again we've probably talked about a lot over the years, but actually we're seeing it in action. We're seeing more progressive and dynamic campaigns as a regular kind of part of the work that we do with clients. So that's encouraging. It's better than it has been in the past. But I think still there is a challenge in terms of organisational structures when it comes to data creation of segments and creation of audiences, and that coming together with the opportunities that are happening in real time. Because I think that's the other big piece of what we're dealing with specifically with mobile is done well, data unlocked from the device, whether it's true real time or whether it's actually just built pretty much real time in terms of being able to see where that device is moving. That's a great opportunity. There's a great opportunity to change dynamic creative, but that needs to be aligned at the start of the campaign. It's not something that necessarily can be done if those two teams, as individuals, aren't talking and setting out on that journey together at the start of whatever the engagement was from that particular brand.
And talking about engagement, we again saw a bit of a divide when it came to measuring and optimizing for viewability. So the group who said they weren't using data as much or as well, they were much more likely to rely on viewability as something to optimize a campaign than the other group. Do you think, are we in a bit of a chicken and an egg situation where because the data savvy group are being more creative, their viewability is just better because the ads are less intrusive and people are engaging? Or do you think it's actually a case that there's still a lot more to be done with viewability in mobile compared to desktop?
I think there's a huge amount more to be done with viewability on mobile. Whether or not one is a reflection of the other, whether the better creativity is a function of better viewability, I guess you could make that assumption, but I'm not sure the research is necessarily saying that. I think what it is saying is that viewability as a way of measuring success is certainly coming through, which I think is encouraging. There's a distinction then between what mobile can add, I think, from a viewable standard than desktop, and I think that's a positive thing to see. But I think it has to fall in line with some of those other factors, which the research is saying, which is that's one measure, that needs to be aligned with viewable plus what, viewable in terms of uplift in footfall if it's a retail or a CPG campaign or an auto campaign, through to sales if it's a more conventional campaign. These are hard and challenging things to do on a regular basis. So that's not to say that some of the media metrics need to be there, but that viewability piece needs to just be a staple part of that. Otherwise, again, we're missing our opportunity to move the game on, especially in light of everything we've talked about with GDPR.
And how much mobile strategy do you think is being influenced by Generation Z and people who are much more connected to their devices compared to sort of previous generations, and a generation where there's a lot less brand loyalty. There's a lot more sort of in the moment. And just building out the fact that, yes, you can track someone, you know where they are, and you can serve them an ad instantly and try and drive that footfall or that sale. But with a sort of, if you play a longer term game, you've got to try and get that brand loyalty. How do you see that playing out?
I think it probably goes back to what we're talking about with the marrying of the creativity and the data piece, in organisationally, because that's no longer just a good thing to do. It's kind of born of what you're describing with Gen Z's behaviours. We recently did some research which showed that Gen Z has a ridiculously sort of accurate insight of the amount of data that's gathered on them and about them. They didn't seem particularly worried about it. That wasn't the point. The point was that they therefore had an expectation of brands that they loved or brands that they were involved in, they would use that data. And if they didn't, they felt somehow that brand didn't particularly want to engage with them. So the personalization element is not only a kind of a nice to have and a good way of driving efficacy of investment and return on investment, but actually is an expectation from the consumer, especially in the Gen Z category. So I think you've got a double whammy there, potentially, as a brand, where fundamentally there's an expectation from the consumer, so if you ignore that, ignore it at your peril, just as much as you wouldn't ignore a feedback on your product. But secondly, it's going to have a massive impact on the loyalty of that particular individual, and the efficacy of campaigns are only going to be an outcome that's going to get worse over time. So Gen Z is a particularly interesting character when it comes to understanding of the data, but then expectation of the brand actually using it in a more meaningful way. The good news on that, I guess, is that they are happy to give permissions. So I don't know if we're kind of naysaying our way into thinking that the world's going to end when we expect permissions. I think it's just a function of understanding how to use that data in a more meaningful way and create more value. So getting that data exchange, an opt-in to an unknown entity is going to be tough, right? We know that. But an opt-in to a brand and an opt-in to somebody or something that adds value, certainly for Gen Z, the research that we've seen tells us that they're happy to do that.
And we have 30 seconds left. So just to summarise, what do you think is coming next in mobile?
In 30 seconds, it's joining the dots as mobile, and I'll get shot dead on tweets, I guess, if I say it's about universal ID for mobile being that universal ID. But I do think that we've got to continue on that path. We've got to use the device ID as a way of linking up both the ad side data and the customer side data. And I think that legislation is pushing us there, consumers are pushing us there. So that's I think the next big thing for us to deal with is making that real and making it easy to do so that we can have it as a standard approach rather than something that's really bespoke.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you very much.